Hi everyone, and welcome back to this lesson of my advanced IELTS Writing Task 1 academic tutorial. Now, in the previous video and in the previous lesson, we focused on paraphrasing skills, especially as it relates to writing the introduction paragraph. So we covered all the strategies that you need in order to successfully paraphrase your question and write the introduction paragraph. Now, the same strategies can be used to paraphrase all kinds of reports. Line graphs, bar charts, pie charts, tables, flowcharts, and maps. And we saw examples of combination charts being paraphrased using the same strategy, interval data, discrete data. So we've seen examples of all, and the strategies are the same. Doesn't depend on the type of chart. The same strategies are used all the time. But when it comes to writing the rest of your report, for example, how are we going to describe our key points in the overview paragraph? How are we going to describe those 2 to 3 sentences that we have targeted for the body paragraphs? So as you can see here, for writing these paragraphs that I've highlighted, the structures that you use depends on the type of data you're given. So for example, if you're given interval data, you're going to talk about increases, decreases, fluctuations, and trends. If you're given a discrete type of chart, then instead of increases and decreases, you're going to focus on comparing amounts by talking about proportions and things that are very different to the types of information included in an interval chart. And the same can be said about qualitative data, that is flowcharts and maps. So what we're going to do in today's lesson and also in the upcoming lessons is we're going to learn a number of different language and grammatical structures that you could use to describe these different kinds of data. So if we summarize what we've looked at before, we have 3 types of data in the IELTS Task 1 writing prompt. And these are interval data, which, if you recall, refers to changes over time. We have discrete data, which looks at points in time, right? So compares amounts and statistics at a single point, usually in time. So it's not about changes. And then we have process data, which is qualitative. So it's a qualitative description of how changes have occurred, right? So this time it's qualitative. So don't confuse it with the quantitative changes that are the focus of interval data. So for today's lesson, we're going to learn the structures for interval data. And we're going to learn how not just to describe the information using these language structures, but we're also going to learn how we can create variety in our writing. That is, if I'm going to mention how something has increased, can I do so using different sentence structures? Or am I going to repeat the same structure and again? So on the day of the test, as you're most likely aware, the examiner is interested in seeing both the grammatical accuracy, the correctness of your writing, but also they want to see evidence of grammatical range. That is, your ability to use different structures to create variety in the grammar you're using. So please bear in mind that even if you think you know how to write sentences describing changes in a quantitative manner, it's always useful to familiarize yourself with different phrases, wording and also structures to create variety in your writing as well. Okay, before we proceed, we need to know what are the different kinds of changes that we need to describe. So I'm going to do this using a table. Okay, so we're going to look at the different kinds of changes one would likely encounter. So, we have increases, decreases, and fluctuations, right? So increases, decreases, and fluctuations. So this is one type of change that we might want to describe. And of the majority of changes you're going to describe are probably going to fall into this category of increases, decreases, and fluctuations. Another thing we want to describe is stable trends. So what if we want to talk about changes that have happened, but they're really stable, right? So no change has occurred. That's also a possibility. What about peaks and low points? These form another category. So what if we want to describe something reaching its highest point and then something reaching its lowest point? What structures would we use then? And finally, you might want to describe points or fixed positions basically in the data. And by this I mean you're not really describing a change. You just want to say that at this point in time, this is how many students we're studying. So it's essentially not a change, but it's something quite useful. So at certain points in your report, you might want to add this information. For example, if you have a line graph and one of your variables will form a paragraph, but you really don't have 3 sentences to include in this description, what you could do, maybe perhaps because it's just a simple increase, then in addition to saying that it has increased, you could talk about its starting point, and then you could add a separate sentence describing that final amount that it reached, right? So this is what I mean by describing points or positions. Okay, so now that we've defined the categories of changes, we're going to look at the different structures that we could use for each. And in each case, I will also show you a few examples as well. Before we get into it, for describing increases, decreases, and fluctuations, you need to know that we often have to describe what is being, what has increased or what has decreased. In other words, we need to state the MP core. If you remember from a few lectures ago, we had to, when understanding the chart, we had to identify the MP and the MP core, right? Because that was going to be essentially what all the numbers and figures in our report represent. So first we need to state or form a subject. And how are we going to do that? I'll show you. It's very simple. So you basically go with the number, the rate, the amount, or perhaps even the percentage of, and then you add whatever your MP is. And this is going to form the subject, right? And we're going to use this subject in different parts of our report and to different ends. So I'll highlight this in green so that we'll consistently use this color whenever we're referring to the subject, right? So far, the subject has been formed. Okay, what's the next thing that we need to be familiar with? So for instance, you have the subject identified here. What are the other elements in our response? Well, when we're dealing with interval data, if you recall, we often talk about time periods, right? So something increased, great, but from what point to what point, right? So we need to know what these adverbial structures are. The most simple adverbial structure is from one point to another point. So you could say something like from January to March, right? So from January to March. You can also use between January and March, right? So that's another way of putting it. So these are used to describe time. All right, so time periods. I'll add T1 and T2 to show you that we're basically looking at a time period. Same goes with between. So for example, you have between T1 and T2. Same for time period. But adverbs aren't only used to describe time periods, they're also used to describe changes in quantities, right? So when we say the number of students increased from January to March, we also want to include how many students were added, right? So what was the number of students in January and what was the number of students in March? How can we do this? So once again, you could use the structure from Q1, meaning quantity 1, to Q2, which is quantity 2. So you could say the number of students, for example, increased between January and March from 2,000 to 4,000, right? So you have both the time and the quantitative range, the number. You can also use by, but then what you need to do is you would need to express the delta Q. And by delta Q, I mean the difference between the starting point and the end point. For example, you could say the number of students increased from January to March from 2,000 to 5,000. So from 2,000, that's the starting point. 5,000, that's the end point. So if it increases from 2,000 to 5,000, how much did it increase by? Well, 5,000 minus 2,000, 3,000. So another way you could express the same idea is you could say the number of students increased from January to March by 3,000 students. So as you can see, where did I come up with this 3,000? Because it was 2,000 and it increased to 5,000. So the difference, the amount by which it increased is 3,000. So as you can see, this is another structure that we could use. And all of these fall under the category of adverbs. So I will highlight this in this color here. Now, the reason I'm showing you these two structures separately is because the subject and the adverbs are basically a constant in our response. So adverbs of time and quantity, right? Adverbs describing time changes and also adverbs describing changes in quantity. These are constants, meaning that in structures for increase, decrease, fluctuations, structures describing stable trends, we're going to recycle and reuse these structures again and again. Okay? Now, let's begin with the first category, which is increases and decreases. So we have two structures that we could use for describing increases, decreases, and fluctuations. One of them involves the use of a verb phrase, and the other one involves the use of a noun phrase. So think of it as two structures. A structure that describes the change using a verb phrase, and a structure that describes the change using something like a noun phrase. I'll show you exactly what these two structures are and how they can be used. So let's start with the structure for the verb phrases. Well, you start with the subject. Remember, the number, rate, amount, percentage of MP. That's going to be the subject right here. So I'll follow the same color coding scheme so it makes more sense for you when you later review this. Okay, so we have the subject in place. Then we're going to express the change in the form of a verb phrase. And this one I'm going to highlight in a different color. Let's highlight it in this shade of red. Okay, and then having done that, we can add our adverbial phrase. So adverbs can be added here. So I'll highlight this in this color. Okay, so if this is the structure, let's see if we can make more sense by writing a few examples, maybe, right? Okay, so I'll show you exactly how this is done on this page here. So let's take a look at the structure one more time. It's subject, verb, and then adverbial. So I'm going to be teaching you a few tips on how to use these structures correctly and how to create variety. So remember, the subject is the number of MP, the rate of MP, the amount of, percentage of, and let's say in this example, we have the number of, again, we'll go with students, right? So my MP is students. Now it's time to look at our verb phrase. But the verb phrase varies depending on whether we are describing an increase, a decrease, or perhaps even a fluctuation. So let's add another table here, and this time let's add a number of categories describing verb phrases for increasing trends. So increases, one for decreases, and then we'll also look at some structures for fluctuations, right? Okay, let's begin with, let's start with increases. So if the number of students went up, how can we express this? Well, it's very easy. You could use verbs, and I'm going to present all of these verbs in the past tense, assuming that the data has been collected. And remember, the past tense is the tense that you will be using mostly in your writing. So you could say the number of students grew. You could say the number of students increased. The number of students rose. The number of students climbed, went up, or even rocketed. Right? So you see, we've already determined what the subject is. So the subject has been identified here. We'll highlight it in green. And then following this, we're going to mention our verb. So in this case, I'm going to say the number of students grew. Okay? So as you can see, my verb, I'm going to highlight the verb phrase in this color. But remember, sometimes it's more than one word. So for example, went up. That's why we refer to it as a verb phrase. So instead of saying the number of students grew, you could say the number of students went up, right? Okay, but what if we're describing a decrease? Well, you could use verbs such as fell, decreased, declined, dropped, and if it's especially hard, you could refer to it as plummeted. So remember, rocketed means to increase very quickly and to a great amount, right? But then the opposite would be plummeted, which means to fall very suddenly and to fall to a very considerable degree. Okay? But which leaves me with fluctuations. How could we mention fluctuations? Well, there's a verb, fluctuated. So you could say the number of students fluctuated. I'm going to write a few more examples here for you to see. So here's the second one, and this time we're going to describe a decrease. So I'm going to go with went down or decreased. And what about fluctuation? Once again, I'll show you. So you could say the number of students fluctuated, right? Same structure, nothing really fancy here. Now, another way you could describe changes is by describing what we call proportional changes. So let's say I have witnessed an increase from 20% to 40%. So it's twice the amount, isn't it? What verbs could we possibly use to describe this? Well, you could say it doubled. So when something goes from 20% to 40%, it has doubled. If it goes from 30% to 90%, then it's tripled. If it goes down from 50% to 25%, it has halved. And you could also use, for example, a structure like decrease to, and then you need some kind of fraction here. And by fraction, I mean a third, maybe a quarter, or a fifth, right? Just a few common examples. So you could say it decreased to a third. So if it was 90%, it decreased to 30%. It decreased to a third. It decreased to a quarter. If it was like 100, it went down to 25. Or a fifth, right? So you get the idea. These structures can be used to describe, as I mentioned, proportional changes. So let's try to add one more example up here to describe these proportional changes. So how can we do that? Well, you could say the number of students, I'm just going to go with the first one, doubled, right? So we have all of our verbs very neatly classified here and broken down into categories based on what kind of change they are describing. Okay, so what about adverbs? Well, one thing you need to know is that when you're describing these changes, when you say grow, it just shows that it went up. It doesn't show me whether it went up quickly or whether it went up slowly, whether it went up only a small amount or whether it increased very considerably. So as you can see, as I'm describing these changes, I'm using certain kinds of adverbs, right? And so here we need some kinds of adverbs to describe the extent or the speed of change that we are observing. So for example, if you want to describe an increase that happened very quickly, well, you can use adverbs such as quickly, swiftly, suddenly, rapidly, and sharply. But sometimes you want to describe an increase that didn't happen very suddenly over a short period of time, but rather it happened into a very great extent. It increased a lot, right? So it went from 5% to something like 80%. So relative to everything else we're seeing in the chart, this increase was greater. So how do we emphasize the great amount in the change, right? Not necessarily happening very quickly. It might have happened over thousands or hundreds of years, but what is important is that the increase was great in amount. How can we do that? What kind of adverbs can we use? Well, you could use adverbs like dramatically, significantly, or considerably. Right? So I hope you now understand the difference between saying something increased quickly versus saying something increased dramatically. All right? In both cases, we have an increase. In one, we're emphasizing the speed and how quickly the increase took place. And in another one, we're emphasizing how great a change has occurred over time. But what about the opposite? What if we want to describe how the change has occurred, but we're not emphasizing how quickly or how great the change has been, but rather we want to emphasize how the change has happened very slowly. All right, so as you can see, the first adverb we could use is slowly. But what else? We could also use gradually or gently. Or if we want to talk about an increase or a decrease that happened in a very small amount, right? It was very insignificant. What could we say? Well, we could say it increased slightly or it increased minimally. All right, these are the adverbs that you could use. There's one more adverb that I want to introduce to you, and that is whenever you're describing an increase or a decrease that wasn't very smooth and steady, but rather the change that occurred was kind of bumpy. So we had an increase, but instead of an increase like this, we have an increase that goes like this, up and down, but the overall trajectory is rising. Or the opposite, you have it going up and down, but the trend is downward. So what kind of adverb could we use there? Well, you could use a modifier like accompanied by fluctuation. How do we use this? I'll show you. So you could say something like the number of students increased accompanied by fluctuation, right? So it means it wasn't a smooth and steady rise, but rather it was a bumpy one. So there were a lot of ups and downs associated, right? So we've also seen the adverbs that you could use with these verbs. And so I want you to bear in mind that these adverbs are not the same as the adverbs that describe time and quantity. These structures, these are different. These are used to form a more accurate verb phrase, right? So they're part of the verb phrase, and so I'm still going to highlight these in red. Okay, so we've also looked at the adverbs that we could use. Okay, so let's add these adverbs, okay? In the first example, I'm going to say the number of students went up dramatically. So it means the change in number was great. Or we could say it decreased slowly, or it fluctuated slightly. No, try not to use adverbs with fluctuated. If it's fluctuated, don't say fluctuated slowly or fluctuated rapidly. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Keep it simple. Also true for doubled. You don't double dramatically. It doubles, right? So no additional adverbs for fluctuation and then proportional changes. Okay, now that we've mentioned the number of students went up dramatically, we also want to add our adverbs, the time period and the amount. Rule number 1, try to mention the amount, the quantity first. The rule is it's easier for your sentences to be understood if the adverb is placed close to the verb. Okay, so adverbs describing quantity should be closer to the verb. Here we could say the number of students went up dramatically by 75%. Notice by is the one we use to describe the difference, right? So maybe it went up from 1% to 76%. So how much did it increase? It increased by 75%. And then I also want to mention the time period. So I'm going to say from January to March. Okay, now here's another one. The number of students decreased slowly. This time, I'm going to mention how much this decreased by mentioning the start and the end point. So instead, I'm going to say from, and let's say 5% to 80%. So it increased by 75%, right? So from 5% to 80%. But it's not great if I say from January to March again. The reason is I have from to, and then I also have from to mentioned one more time, which isn't great. It's a little redundant and repetitive. So what can I do instead? Well, instead of saying from January to March, I can say between January and March. Okay, so there. If you want to create even more change in your writing, here's what you could do. So this time, consider placing the adverb of time between January and March, or maybe from January to March at the beginning of your sentence. Let me show you what I mean. So here, my sentence is going to be from January to March, the number of students fluctuated. You see, I have stated the adverb of time at the very beginning. And you could do this for any of these sentences. So here, for example, you could say the number of students went up dramatically by 75% from January to March, or you could say from January to March, the number of students went up dramatically by 75%. So you see, here's a little tip that I want to share with you. Adverbs can move, right? Especially adverbs of time can be placed either at the end or at the very beginning of your sentence. Another thing about adverbs is even in your verb phrase, you can switch your adverb position. So for example, here I can say the number of students went up dramatically by 75%, or I could say the number of students dramatically went up by 75%. So you can see it's went up dramatically went up. They are both correct. So both structures can be used. Or in this case, I could have said the number of students slowly decreased instead of decreased slowly. Which one's better? No difference. They're both the same. They're both correct. But remember, what's important is that by creating these variations, you are producing sentences that are different in structure. And so the examiner will appreciate this variety in your sentence structures and the way you're expressing your ideas. Okay, so what else can we change? Well, adverbs of time, we saw, we can move them around. And so we can create differences here. Let's add adverb of time to the third sentence. Let's see how we can do that. See, it says from January to March, the number of students fluctuated. But how do we describe fluctuation? Because fluctuation is essentially a variable that starts at a point, goes up and down, up and down, up and down, and then reaches about the same amount. If it goes up, that's an increase accompanied by fluctuation. If it goes down, that's a decrease accompanied by fluctuation. We are describing a fluctuation that happens around a central point. And so what you're going to do is you're going to use the preposition around, right? So it fluctuated around 20%, for example. And so I'm going to highlight this in the same color that we've used to describe adverbs. So bear in mind that the adverb, the preposition we use to describe the adverb of quantity is around for the verb fluctuation. All right, now let's do this one. The number of students doubled. Okay. Am I going to mention from what point to another? Not necessarily, especially if your sentences are linked together. So later, I'm going to show you how to write a response by combining these sentences together. And sometimes when you combine sentences together, you get to create additional variety. So let's say the previous sentence we said that the number of students reached 20%. Okay, so before we read this sentence, the one highlighted here, we know that it reached 20%. And then we say, following this, the number of students doubled. It's obvious. If it was 20% and it doubled, it means it went up from 20% to 40%. So do I need to say the number of students doubled to 40%? Probably not, because it's understandable from the context, from what came before it. So no need for you to mention the numbers all the time, right? But you want to mention the time. So we're going to say from, let's say March to the end of April. So once again, we have from March to the end of April. We're going to highlight that in the same color that we use to highlight all of our adverbs, right? So as you can see, we have used the structures that we introduce the first structure, the verb phrase structure, to write sentences describing increases, decreases, and also fluctuations. Okay, so far we have covered one structure, but if you remember, we actually have two. The first structure was the subject verb verb phrase adverb structure. This time we're going to follow the noun phrase structure, and the noun phrase structure has a fixed component. You say there was, and then following this you add a noun phrase, and then you say in subject, and you add any adverb that you have to the end. So there was, that's a fixed structure. So every single sentence that you produce in this structure will start with there was, okay? The MP, we're going to use a different color for the MP. So let's say we'll go with purple, right? So MP. In, that's again part of the structure. Subject, we'll use the same color, green, to describe the subject. And then finally, the adverb will be in the same color as we've been doing and following so far. Okay, so let me copy this structure just as we did with the first structure down here, and let's try to learn different ways of introducing the same structure and forming our sentences in a variety of ways. Okay, so let's begin with the noun phrase. Remember, it's all about the noun phrase. Last time we described increases, decreases, and fluctuations, and also proportional changes in using verb phrases. This time we're going to do the same, but instead of a verb phrase, we're going to use a noun phrase, right? So I'll remove all of this and replace them with a noun phrase. And we decided to represent the noun phrase in purple. So for an increase, well, the name is quite self-explanatory. We are going to use an increase. You see, that's a noun form of the verb increase, right? You could also refer to it as a rise, or there was a growth in something, right? So these are the structures we use for increases. For decreases, what could you use? Once again, same color. We could use there was a fall, or there was a decline, or there was a drop in the number of something, right? So here we have the noun phrases. Or for fluctuation, you could say there was a fluctuation in the number of whatever. So a fluctuation. So far we have there was noun phrase. Let's do one example, huh? And you know what? I'm going to take, to make this even easier, I'm going to take these sentences that we wrote before, and I'm going to transform them one by one using the structure that we have here. Are you ready? Let's see. So we don't have the number of, right? So instead of starting with the subject, this time the subject comes after. So I'm going to delete this. Okay? Instead, I'm going to use there was. And you know what? To make this also color-coded, I'll follow the color yellow for the fixed parts. So watch. I'm going to say there are. Oh, I'm sorry, there was. Okay, so here it says dramatically went up. Okay, now check it out. I can take the same adverb that I had before and change it into an adjective. The original sentence was, the previous sentence was, the number of students dramatically went up. So here I'm going to say there was a dramatic. Now, went up. Remember, I could say increase, rise, growth. I'm going to say a dramatic rise. Okay, so far are you with me? Should be pretty easy. Then I have another part, which is part of the structure, which is in. And then I'm going to add my subject in the number of students. And then finally, I'm going to mention my adverb. And you know what? I can just pretty much copy and paste this here. Let's read the sentence. There was a dramatic rise in the number of students by 75% from January to March. You see, I'm following this same structure. Now, bear with me. I'm gonna basically rewrite all of these. Okay. The second sentence was the number of students decreased slowly from 5% to 80% between January and March. You know what? I'm feeling adventurous today, so I'm gonna create more variety. So what can I do? Well, I'll start with the adverb. I'll start with this adverb. My sentence will begin with between January and March. Now, very important tip here. Whenever you start with an adverb of time, like between January and March, you always need a comma. So there should be a comma after the initial adverb. Okay, so between January and March, what next? The fixed structure. There was. So I'm just going to copy that here. So from January to March, there was. Now, there was what? Decreased slowly has to change into a noun form. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say there was, whoops, the color should be purple. I'm changing it into a noun. So I'm going to say there was a slow decrease, or there was a slow decline. Remember, decline was also a verb that I could use. And then what do I need to say? I need to say in something. So here, I'm going to say there was a slow decline in, and then the subject will be repeated. And guess what? At the end, I'm going to add the adverb for quantity. So let's read the sentence. Let's see if this makes sense. Between January and March, there was a slow decline in the number of students by 75%. Sounds good, right? Okay, let's do the next one. So decreased slowly, we've done this one. What about the one that focuses on fluctuation? I'm gonna make some more changes. So one more time. Gonna start with the yellow part. Fixed expression. There was. Okay? But then this one, it's describing a fluctuation. So what am I gonna say? I'm gonna say there was a fluctuation. There was a fluctuation. And then I have to say in something. So there was a fluctuation in what? The number of students. Okay? And then I'm going to mention from January to March, the time period as well. Here, this comes at the end. And voila. Now, one thing I've missed in my example is this, around 20%. Where does this go? So we could say there was a fluctuation around 20% in the number of students from January to March. You see, every single element in the original verb phrase structure made its way to this new structure that I have. And let's do this last one as well. So check it out. The number of students doubled from March to the end of April. So this time, once again, I'm going to start my sentence with an initial adverb. Okay? Just to demonstrate how these changes can be, and these variations can be applied to your response. So from March to the end of April, and then I'm going to say there was. Now, we had a proportional change last time, so we said it doubled, right? So here, instead of double, I could perhaps say something like a dramatic rise or a dramatic growth. Notice when I say a dramatic growth, it does not necessarily indicate that it was doubled, but when something doubles, it's considered a great increase, right? So it's doubled, essentially. So we could call it a dramatic growth because the structure that we have for noun phrases cannot be as easily used to describe proportional changes, such as doubling or half, reducing to a half or something along those lines. So we could say there was a dramatic growth, and then we're going to mention the subject, right? So in, and then you add the number of students to the end. And then if it doubled, then maybe you could add the amount in detail by saying from 20% to 40%, which is essentially a doubling, right? So for all of these sentences, which we previously wrote using the verb phrase structure, we have now produced an example using the noun phrase structure. So as you can see, very easy and accessible. Doesn't matter what your level of English is, as long as you are able to follow this pattern in writing and this grammatical structure, things are going to be really easy. Two things that I need to point out regarding the noun phrase structure. Number one, you cannot change the noun adjective format. What do I mean by this? So it's always a slow decline. It's not like the adverb where you can say slowly declined and declined slowly. Here you have slow decline. The adjective should always come before the noun. Another thing I want to point out is that sometimes, and this is something we're going to look at later when it comes to writing, actual writing, but sometimes you can replace the subject with a pronoun. And so, or you could maybe drop the subject altogether. I'll show you. Let's say we're connecting two sentences together. The first sentence is, there was a dramatic rise in the number of students by 75% from January to March. And then I want to say, following this, there was a dramatic growth in the number of students from 20% to 40%. How do I do this? So you could say it like this. You could say there was a dramatic rise in the number of students by 75% from January to March, followed by a fluctuation around 20%, or followed by a dramatic growth in the number of students from 20% to 40%. You see what I just did there? I used followed by, and then I added the noun phrase, and I didn't have to repeat the there was part. The same thing is also true for structures that are following the verb phrase construction. How is that done? I'll show you. So for example, you could say the number of students dramatically went up by 75% from January to March. And then in the next sentence, you say, next, it decreased slowly. So as you can see, instead of saying the number of students again and repeating myself, I very simply used the pronoun it to replace it. And so the sentences read better and there's less redundancy involved. Okay. What about adjectives? Is there any way that we can modify these nouns? So in the previous example, we had adverbs, right? So you could say it increased quickly, swiftly, suddenly, rapidly, or you could say it increased slowly, gradually, gently. What about if we're using a noun phrase? Is there any way to make a distinction between an increase that happens very slowly or very slightly versus an increase that happens very dramatically or very quickly? How can we make this distinction? And it's through the use of adjectives. So if it happens fast, then you could use something like quick, swift, sudden, and sharp. let me show you how that would work. So remember in the examples we had, there was a dramatic rise. So you see, it's not just any kind of rise. In the previous example, we had dramatically in the verb construction. And so here we have dramatic, right? So as you can see, it's the adjective that is accompanying the noun describing how this change took place. So as you can see, we could use dramatic, significant, and considerable. What about the opposite? What if the increase or the decrease that I'm describing using this noun phrase structure happened to a very small degree or happened very slowly? Well, if it's the speed you're talking about and it's slow, well, you could use slow, gradual, and then also gentle. There was a gentle rise, right? So these are some adjectives you could use. And then if it increases or decreases, not slowly, but to a very small amount or to a very small extent, then you could use slight or minimal. So what do I mean? I could say a quick increase. I could say a dramatic increase. I could refer to a swift fall, or I could refer to a significant drop. So you see, you mix and match and you create different noun phrase combinations. Same thing can be said for this column here. You could talk about a slow growth, or perhaps a slight rise. You could talk about perhaps a gradual decline or a minimal drop, right? So mix and match to create different structures and to create variety in your writing. But I'm still going to highlight all of this in the same color because this is still part of the noun phrase construction that we are forming. Okay, so far we have looked at increases, decreases, and fluctuations using verb phrases and noun phrases, right? And we saw what the two structures are. We've reviewed some examples, and we've also looked at some ways in which you can create that much needed variety. What about stable trends? What if we want to talk about no change at all? Well, once again, we can follow the verb phrase structure, or we can follow the noun phrase structure. So let's go down here and let's see how we can write these different structures. So here we are describing no change. So describing no change in data. And there are two structures. Remember, we have the verb phrase structure and the noun phrase structure. Let's start with the verb phrase structure. So the verb phrase structure, similar to the verb phrase structure that we use to describe increases and decreases, it starts with the subject. So we have, the number of students. But then the verb phrase that you use will be described here. So the verb phrases that you could use, I'll try to categorize them all here in the form of another table. So these tables should help out a lot. Yes, so check it out. One form of this verb phrase for describing no change in our data is to say it stayed the same. So the number of students stayed the same. You could say the number of students remained steady or remained stable. Right? Same structure, really. It's just different wording. Same structure and just different verb phrase that we're using. Or if you even want to create more variety, you could say the number of students experienced no change at all. That's for emphasis if you want to add the at all. Or very simply, you could say the number of students did not change. Okay, so here you use subject, verb phrase, and then you have your adverb at the end. So if we want to color code this and then come up with an example, the subject was color coded in green, so it's the same structure as before. The verb phrase, we're going to use the same color as above, so we'll use red one more time, and the adverb was consistently shown in blue, so we're going to do the same. Now, let's try to write a few examples here for you all to see. So my first example is going to be the number of students remained steady from January to March. Notice what I did? The number of students, this is my subject, so I'm going to color code this in green. And then remained steady, this is my verb phrase that I'm using. And so if you're wondering where did these verb phrases come from, here. Remember, I just introduced them to you. So these are all the structures that you could describe no change at all. Okay? And then from January to March, that's my adverb. Can I play around with this structure? 100%. So what I could do is this time I could say from January to March, the number of students remained stable. Or you know what? Why not use a different structure altogether? Experienced no change. Again, if we are to color code this, we would say from January to March is my initial adverb. And then the number of students, that would be my subject. And then experienced no change is the verb phrase that I'm using. Now, you might be wondering at this point, how do we describe the amount? Like, if it's the same, we still have to mention what number it was stuck on, right? So what was that number where it remained steady or stable? Well, this is easy. You could use at, right? So the preposition for describing amounts in adverbial form is at. I'll show you. So for example, you could say remained steady at 20% from January to March. So as you can see, again, the color coding would be the same because we marked all adverbs in blue. Or here we could say from January to March, the number of students experienced no change at 20%. All right, so it was stuck at this 20% level. So we have two adverbs, and as you can see, sometimes we can put both adverbs next to each other. At 20%, adverb of quantity from January to March, adverb of time. And sometimes we separate them. So here we have from January to March, adverb of time, at 20%, that is my adverb of quantity. But remember, there's also another structure that I can use to this end. So far, we've looked at the verb phrase structure. And now we're going to look at the noun phrase structure for describing stable trends. And once again, it's going to be very similar to the noun phrase structure that we saw for describing increases, decreases, and fluctuations. So this time we're going to say there was, okay, just like before. Remember, we had a fixed expression, there was. I'm going to highlight that in the same color. So we're going to highlight that in yellow. And then after that, you're going to use the noun phrase. And so just like before, how we had the noun phrases color-coded in purple, we're going to do the same again. So here, noun phrase, and then you add any adverb to the end of your sentence. So this is the color. Okay, we should now be able to paraphrase these two sentences which we wrote before, and this time transform them into the noun phrase structure, right? So let's push this all down to a fresh page, and then from there we'll see how we can paraphrase our structure from the verb phrase structure here to the noun phrase structure as seen here. Okay, let's try to do this. The first sentence says the number of students remained steady at 20% from January to March. Okay, I'm not going to shuffle the order around. I could, but I just want to show you how you can take the verb phrase structure and turn it into a noun phrase structure. I'm not going to make any additional changes deliberately. So let's see. We're going to say there was, and this is the fixed structure. And so I'm going to highlight that in yellow. Okay, so there was. What do I have after that? Well, after there was, I'm going to mention the noun phrase. So what is this noun phrase that I'm supposed to use? Let me introduce these noun phrases to you, and you'll see how easy it is to find the matching structure. So, for example, in the verb phrase, we said stayed the same, remained steady, remained stable. These were the structures that we were using previously. So now we have to see what their equivalents are in noun phrase format. So, for example, you could say no change, or a period of stability, or perhaps you could say little change. And so there's a difference between saying little change and a little change. Never say there was a little change, because you're focusing on there being a change. But when you say there was little change, it means it was so little that it was insignificant. We're focusing on the fact that it was so small that we can, neglect it, or we can somehow not even consider it, because the change is so minuscule. So check it out. I have the noun phrase in purple. So there was, I'm going to go with no change, right? In the previous one, what did I say? They said remained steady. So I think I could use no change. So there was no change. Make sure the color's right. And then I'm going to say in what, right? So there was no change. And then I have to mention what? I forgot to mention this here. You see, when you say there was noun phrase, and then you're going to say in, just like the previous structure that we had. So this is fixed. This is going to be yellow. And then you add the subject. Never forget the subject. The subject always has to be included here. And if you recall, for the subject, the color we would use is green. So I'm just going to use the same color here. And there you go. Okay, so check it out. There was no change. Now I'm going to add the preposition in. And then following this, I'm going to add my subject, which is the number of students, right? So this is something I can copy. There was no change in the number of students. And then I'm going to mention the time from January to March. But I haven't mentioned the amount. Remember, there was no change in the number of students. I can place both adverbs here next to each other. So let's see. The original sentence in the verb phrase style was the number of students remained steady at 20% from January to March. The noun phrase equivalent is there was no change in the number of students at 20% from January to March. Let's do another one. Again, if you like, you can pause the video here and do this for yourself and then play the video and see if you got it right. It says from January to March. Okay, I'm gonna repeat this. So the initial adverb, I'm just gonna keep it in place. And then I'm gonna say there was, this one goes here. No need for the T to be capital. It's in the middle of my sentence. So there was what? It says experience no change. So here I'm going to say a period of stability between or from January to March. There was a period of stability. Okay, remember this is one of the noun phrase structures that I listed here, a period of stability. And then what am I going to add? Well, there was a period of stability in the number of students. Remember, the subject needs to be mentioned. Same color coding as before, so it's not going to be very different. And then finally, I have at 20%, right? Let's see, where does this go? From January to March, there was a period of stability in the number of students. Yes, so we want it to be close to the noun phrase, at 20%. So there you have it. These are the two structures that we use to describe no change or stability in the data that we're describing. Okay, so we have now covered increases, decreases, and fluctuations with two structures, verb phrase and noun phrase. And we've used pretty much the same structure, the same two structures to describe stable trends, which is why I'm copying it down here. The next change that we want to describe is peaks and low points. So a peak is a point which is higher than any other point for that variable. And a low point is the exact opposite. It is the lowest amount that a variable reaches relative to all previous and subsequent points that have been reached, right? So it's the lowest point, essentially. So what kind of structures can we use to describe peaks and low points? Well, we only have a very simple structure here, and that is very similar to the structures that we have seen before. I'll show you exactly how these structures can be used. So basically, you start with the subject, right? So I'll leave the structure here. We have the subject, which is going to be basically color-coded in green, because it's it's not very similar, but identical to the structure that we have used before. And then you're going to follow it with a verb phrase. So you could say that this structure is very similar to the verb phrase structure that we have seen before. And then you add your adverb to the end. So essentially, it is a verb phrase structure, but the verb phrases that we use have to describe peaks and low points. Let me show you what I mean by looking at a few examples here. So we are describing peaks and low points. All right, so we know what the structure is going to look like, and all we have to do is essentially review the format that goes into the verb phrase construction that we'll be using. Let me show you. So, for example, we start with the subject one more time. And then we have a verb phrase. And then finally we have an adverb. We covered this already, right? But I want to get the color coding right, because it's very helpful if you learn through this color coding system. It'll make your life a lot easier when it comes to the actual writing process, because I've had students tell me that when they're taking the test, sometimes they kind of see what needs to come next because they're familiar with the color pattern. So they kind of know, oh, whenever I have a subject, I need to follow it up with a verb, and that's what comes in, that red color, or the adverb. Oh, I forgot to mention the blue part. So as you can see, these the color coding scheme that you can see here can help you remember the structures and to use the structures accurately. Okay, so what are the verb phrases that we could use to describe peaks and low points? So we need we actually need to separate these two. We need one set of structures for describing peaks and one set of structures for perhaps describing low points. Let's start with peaks, right? So you could say it reached a peak. That's one structure that you could use. And again, we need to color code this in red, right? So it reached a peak. What else can we say? We could say it reached, and I'm using the past tense again because most of the sentences that we'll be writing will be in the past because the data has been collected in the past. The few exceptions are, when we're talking about the future. And a lot of the time you can adjust the verbs very easily. So instead of saying the number of students reached a peak, you could simply transform it to the number of students will reach a peak. So you just use the future tense instead, or will reach a high point. The opposite would be reached a low point, or you could use the structure it bottomed out, right? So the number of students reached a low point, or the number of students bottomed out. So these are the structures. So let's see how we can put these sentences into action. So I'll start with my subject, the number of students. That is going to be green, corresponding to this part of the structure. And then I need my verb phrase. So the number of students, and I want to talk about a peak. So reached a peak. What about the quantity? So immediately after peak, you're going to say a peak of 80%, right? And then you need to mention the time period. So let's say it's in the month of March. There, the number of students reached a peak of 80% in March. What if I want to talk about a low point? How can I do that? Well, to create some variety in my sentence structure, what I will do is I will start my sentence with the adverb of time. And so I will say, in March, the number of students reached a peak, right? Now, remember, the preposition that you use for time will depend on what the unit for time is. So for example, if it's happening during a month, we know that for months we use in. If you're talking about a particular, time of the day, again, you could say in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening. If it's a particular, time on the clock, then you could say at 12 o'clock, at 1 p.m., right? Or maybe the peak happens in a duration. So you could say, between February and September, it reached a peak, something along those lines. So here we have in March, the number of students. And so we want to go with a different structure. This time we're going to say the number of students bottomed out. But the preposition for bottomed out is no longer of. It's actually at, right? So if you want to know what the prepositions are, the preposition for reached a peak is of, right? So reached a peak of, and then go ahead and mention whatever quantity it is. Reached a high point of, and once again, mention the quantity. Reached a low point of, so far everything can be described, the quantities using of, but then for bottom out, the preposition is, as I mentioned, at. So it bottomed out at this particular amount, and there you go. These are the structures that you could use to describe peaks and low points. All right. So we've looked at the structures for describing increases, decreases, and fluctuations. We've looked at the structures for describing stable trends. We've looked at structures for peaks and low points. Now it's time for us to look at the structures we can use to describe points or positions. Let me very briefly tell you what I mean by a point or a position. So in an interval type of chart, we're always talking about increases, decreases, fluctuations. We've established that. But sometimes in order to add sentences to our paragraph, or perhaps to emphasize a point in the chart, which isn't necessarily an increase or decrease, but it's the fact that this variable has stood at that level or has reached this number or this amount. This is where you can use the structure for describing points or positions. And again, the structure we'll be using for this will be very similar to the verb phrase structures that we have seen before. So once again, we want a subject, a verb phrase, and adverbial construction. And what we're going to do is we're going to see what are the different verb phrases that you could possibly use to describe these peaks and these specific points in your chart. So let's go all the way down. Let's add a new heading and we'll take it from there. So we are describing points in a chart. So points in the data. Let's call it points in the data. And we know the structure we'll be using is subject, verb phrase, plus adverb, the adverbials or the adverbs that we'll be adding. So subject, once again, the color was green. The verb phrase, we decided to go with this shade of red. And then all adverbs were described with the color blue. Okay, now it's time for us to look at some of these verb phrases that we could use. And we actually have 3 verb phrases that we could use to this end. These structures are stood at. So we could say the number of students stood at 20%, and then you mention what time, like in January or at the beginning of the period, right? And the other one, you could say started off at. This is only when you're describing the starting point. So stood at, you could use it to describe any point in the middle and towards the beginning of the period, towards the end, it doesn't matter. But when you're using started off at, you want to bring this, you want to use this structure only when you are pointing to the initiation point, right? So started off at. And then finally, you could say it finally reached. And this structure doesn't really need a preposition. Let's see how we can use this structure to form a complete sentence. So for example, I'm going to say the number of students stood at, and then I'm going to mention the amount, right? So let's say 2%. And then I'm going to mention the beginning of the period, so or in the middle. So I'm just going to say in January. Let's color code the number of students. This is going to be my subject. Stood at, that's my verb phrase indicating the point. And then 2% in January will be my adverb. Can I play around? Can I say in January the number of students stood at 2%? 100%. So once again, as with previous verb phrase constructions and other structures, we can take the adverb of time, sometimes place it at the beginning, and sometimes place it at the end of my sentence. Let's do another example. This time, the number of students, okay, started off, so this is the beginning. I don't know what it was before. I'm talking about the very first number that I see describing this trend. So we could say started off at 10% in, and let's say the time period starts in September of one year and ends in the September of the next year. So here we have in September, which is the starting point. Again, if I want to color code, the number of students will be my subject started off at. This is going to be my verb phrase, and then 10% in September is my adverbial. So as you can see, describing points in the data is very simple and straightforward. All you need to do is learn these verb phrases and manage to follow the verb phrase construction for writing your sentence. Okay, so we have now covered all of the structures for describing data that is interval. Okay, so if we have a line graph, we're going to be using a lot of these structures for describing that line graph. Or if, for example, we have a table that shows, consecutive years, so the number of purchases that people made from 3 websites in 5 years, so from 2000 to 2005. So as you can see, I can look at those numbers, compare them, and observe changes such as an increase or a decrease. And so I can use different structures to describe what has taken place in this table, even though tables are usually representing discrete data. So what is important is that you understand the nature of the data, and if you believe that the data you have in front of you is interval, then you could use any of these structures. Now, let's try to write a few sentences based on maybe a real example. And to do this, I am going to show you a sample chart here, and we're going to try to write a few sentences describing different things, really. So sometimes we want to describe an increase, sometimes we want to describe a decrease, or sometimes we want to describe maybe a fluctuation, perhaps. So let's start with this line here. Okay, so I have this line, which corresponds to this variable, and I'm going to write a sentence using my structures. So it's a decrease. I have a number of options. Remember, we had starting with the verb, so we have verb phrase construction, and then we have a structure that includes a noun phrase structure. Let's start with the verb phrase structure. So remember, the structure was subject, verb phrase, adverb. Pretty easy, right? And we're going to use the color coding again, because I know this is going to be helpful to many of you out there. So verb phrase, and then the adverb will be coded as well. Okay, so let's do this step by step. The subject, it's the number of students. Remember the MP core, we previously identified it. And so we're going to say the number of students. Now, is it any students? No, it's students enrolled in hard science majors. So I'm going to say that. I'm going to say enrolled in hard science majors. So sometimes you need to specify the MP. We're not referring to the number of students. We're referring to the number of students in one category. So you have to specify that category. Sometimes students forget and they end up writing sentences that are really meaningless, because when you say the number of students increased or decreased, which group, right? So you need to be specific. The number of students in hard science majors. Okay, so I need a verb. I can use decreased, declined, fell, dropped, right? Any of the verbs that we looked at before. I'm just going to use decreased. Now, did it decrease by a lot, or did it decrease very sharply? No, it kind of happened gradually. So I'm going to use the adverb gradually. So the number of students enrolled in hard science majors decreased gradually. Now I'm going to mention the amount and the time. Which one comes first? The amount should come first. So I'm going to say from over 10,000, right? To how much? From over 10,000 to above 8,000, right? Above 8,000. So I mentioned the amounts, and then I need to mention the time from 1965 to 2005. Now I've already used from to, so I'm going to use between now. So between 1965 and 2005, right? There you go. So let's use the color coding. The number of students enrolled in hard science majors will serve as my subject. Decreased gradually is my verb phrase. And from over 10,000 to above 8,000 between 1965 and 2005, these are all my my adverbs, right? Okay, what if I want to use the other structure and I want to create some variety? So this time I'm going to say from 1965 to 2005. Notice what I'm doing. I'm starting my sentence with the adverb this time. Okay? Now, I'm going to use the other structure, which was the noun phrase structure. What was that like? So remember we had there was, and then you add the noun phrase, and then you add in, the subject comes next, and the adverb appears at the end. So if we want to color code, again, we have yellow, the noun phrase, we're going to highlight in, I believe it was purple, in is yellow, subject is green, and then the adverb at the end will go with the same color we've been using consistently. Okay, so from 1965 to 2005, this is my adverb. Okay, so this is the color I'm using. Then I'm going to say there was, right? This is the fixed expression. This is yellow. It's just something that we need to repeat in this structure. There was, and now I have to mention what it was. So here we had decreased gradually. So I have to come up with a noun. I could say decrease, fall, decline. So I'm going to say there was a decline. And then here we had gradually, which was an adverb that went into our into our verb phrase construction. Here, instead of gradually, maybe I could say there was a gradual decline, or there was a slow decline. It really doesn't matter as long as it accurately describes what you see in the data. So what are we going to use as for color coding this? It is our noun phrase, and so we're going to color code it in purple. Next, we're going to say in. That's going to be another fixed part of our response, so we're going to use the same color. And then the subject, in the number of students. Any students? No. In the number of students enrolled in hard science majors, right? And then I mention from 10,000 to above 8,000. And I believe it was from over 10,000. So I'll keep that constant. So the number of students enrolled in hard science majors, this is my subject. And then from over 10,000 to above 8,000, that's my adverb, right? So what I just did is I described this line using two structures. First, the subject verb adverb structure, and then next using the noun phrase structure that you could see here. Okay, but what if I want to describe a period where there was no change? Let's take this part of the chart, right? So this is related to medicine. It's from 1995 to 2005. There was no change at below 8,000, right? Okay, so what structure are we going to use for this? Well, let's go back. We have this structure, and these were the verb phrases that we could use. So our structure is very similar. It can be very similar to the verb phrase construction that we've seen before, and it can also be similar to the noun phrase construction. It's really up to you. We'll start with the verb phrase construction, right? So here is the structure, and now we're going to describe the change, or maybe the lack of change, really. So let's start with the subject. The number of students enrolled in medicine, right? So this time, we were using a different line to describe this period of stability. Now, you could say the number of students enrolled in medicine. So sometimes the category is mentioned after the noun. So students enrolled in medicine. Enrolled in medicine is the post modifier explaining the noun. Sometimes you treat it as an adverb. So instead of saying the number of students enrolled in medicine, you could say the number of medical students. Then we need to mention the verb phrase. Now remember, there was no change, right? So what we could say is basically the number of medical students remained unchanged, right? That's the verb phrase. And then we need to mention the time and the amount. At below 8,000 from, and what was the period? It was from 1995 to 2005. So from 1995 to 2005. So if we color code this, the number of medical students is the subject. Remained unchanged is the verb phrase, really. At below 8,000 is the first part of our adverb, reflecting the quantity, and then from 1995 to 2005 is the second part of our adverb corresponding to the time period, right? Okay, so what if I want to use the other structure for describing no change at all? So the way you would do this is this time you would use this structure, and then you would use a noun phrase such as no change, period of stability, or little change. So let me show you how this is done. We're going to change the same sentence and transform it into this noun phrase style of expression. So this time we're going to say there was a period of stability. Or we could just say there was no change in the number of medical students, right? From 1995 to 2005. Now, you may have noticed that I dropped the below 8,000. And if I wanted to mention it, I would have to mention it, here. Exactly at below 8,000, right here. But remember, again, as I mentioned before, what we should do is we should learn to get rid of any information that might be contextually understandable. What do I mean by this? So if in the previous sentence we mentioned that the number of students reached 8,000 in 1995, and then we say there was no change in the number of students from 1995 to 2005, it's obvious that the amount was stable at 8,000 because we mentioned it reached 8,000 in 1995. So if after 1995 it remained stable, it will have remained stable at that certain amount that was mentioned. So, sometimes it's redundant. In this case, let's color code. There was is part of the structure. No change is the noun phrase that we're using here. In is part of the structure, so we're going to highlight that in yellow. The number of medical students, what is that? That's the subject, isn't it? So it's going to be green, and then from 1995 to 2005, we'll highlight that in blue, as always. Okay, so we've looked at we've done a sample increase, decrease. We did like one decrease. We've done a period of stability. Now we want to mention a peak, how it reaches a peak. Very quickly, we're going to review the structure first, and then I'll show you how you could write this. So the structure is basically subject, verb, adverb, and these are the verb phrases. So we have reach a peak, reach a high point, reach a low point, and bottom out. So let's see. This is the structure. And note, I'm going to describe this part of the chart. So this is the peak that I'm describing. It is in engineering majors, and it happens in the year 1975, right? And it's over 10,000. Okay, let's see if we can remember all these details. So I'm going to start my sentence with the adverb. So the time, in 1975. In 1975. Okay, and don't forget the comma. Remember, every time you begin a sentence with an adverb, you place a comma after it. So in 1975, the number of engineering students, okay, so here we have the adverb, we have the subject, and now we want to say that it hit the roof. So I'm going to say reached a peak of, I would think it was over 10,000, if I'm not mistaken. So let's just double check real quick. Yes, it was over 10,000, and it happened in 1975, and it corresponds to engineering students. So it looks like it's correct. So in 1975, the number of engineering students reached a peak of over 10,000, and that's it. So in 1975, I'll highlight that in blue. The number of engineering students is my subject. I'm going to highlight that in green. Reached a peak is my, basically my verb phrase structure. Of over 10,000 is the other part of my adverb. It's the quantity, right? So here we also reviewed an example of how you could describe a peak. And finally, the last structure that we're going to practice pertains to, you got it, describing a point in the data. And so we can talk about any point, we can talk about a starting point, or we can talk about where it eventually landed. So let's take a look at this one. We haven't done arts and humanities, right? And so let's say we want to mention this end point, how in 2005, it reaches below 6%. So it's going to be very similar to what I just said. But let's copy the structure anyway. So the structure is once again, subject, verb, phrase, adverb. Okay, so subject, verb, phrase, adverb. And let's start with the subject. So the number of students registered in arts and humanities majors. Okay, what do you think? So the number of students enrolled in arts and humanities majors. Notice I could have said the number of arts and humanities students. Remember, sometimes you can use it as an adjective coming before the NP, the head NP. Sometimes it appears after. And so sometimes you can only do one. Keep that in mind. Sometimes only one option is possible, but it's always a good idea to play around with these structures if you can. All right, so far we have the subject down. So the number of students registered in arts and humanities majors, this is gonna have to be in green. And then what am I gonna say? I'm gonna mention my verb phrase. So finally reached. And then what was the number? Under 6,000. So under 6,000. And then what was the year? In 2005. Okay, so we have the subject. Finally reached is my verb phrase. So remember, highlight that in purple. And then under 6,000, it's quantity in 2005. Let's read it. the number of students registered in arts and humanities majors finally reached under 6,000 or below 6,000 in 2005. Okay, this brings our lesson for today to an end. We reviewed all the structures that you need in order to write an interval data chart, write a report for an interval data chart. We've looked at increases, decreases, fluctuations, peaks, low points, and just random points in the chart. And I hope that you'll be able to use these structures in your responses. In the next video, we're going to review the structures for discrete data. And in the video after that, we will examine the structures that you could use for describing qualitative data, that is for maps and flowcharts. Once we've taken care of all these structures and we've learned them well, we will have a series of lessons in which I will show you how to write an actual response using everything we've learned. So everything about the planning stage, the paragraphing, identifying the key points. I will demonstrate everything step by step, and we will write a sample together. If you enjoyed this video, please do me a favor, like, subscribe, and share this link with other people who may find this content useful. And keep in mind that you can access complete video tutorials plus additional content by becoming a member of this channel. As always, thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one.